This video is a complete beginner's guide to Blender 4. It's the first in a two-part series and is designed to be very methodical, introducing skills slowly with a steady progression until you finish this fun scene which you can see behind me. I'm a 3D artist with over 20 years teaching experience, and I've tried to put all that knowledge together so it should hopefully be accessible to all users with absolutely no knowledge of Blender at all. It's split into chapters so you can continue where you left off, and if you like this approach then do check out my other courses, discount links in the description. This tutorial is sponsored by NVIDIA, and I'll be showing you how I'm using AI denoising powered by my NVIDIA RTX 40 series GPU for the best experience. So the very first thing you'll want to do is go across to blender.org and download Blender if you haven't already. At the front of the site you will see the download option for the latest version. If there is anything in this tutorial which has changed in newer versions, then do check the description where I'll write notes of any changes. If you go into the download section, you can see the latest version here, and you can also download Mac, Linux and other versions here. So when you first load up Blender, you get a splash screen like this, and you'll see the version you're using up the top corner here. You'll see your recent files over to the right, and you can generate a new file based on the template on the left here. It's also worth noting that you can recover the last session in case things crash, and you can also open up files here. I'm going to start with a general file. You can click on this, or you can actually just click on the scene itself because that is a general startup file. So the first thing you'll notice is this big viewport here. That's the 3D viewport. We've got some other windows to the right here as well, and one down at the bottom here. I'll talk about those later. To navigate the viewport, it's generally much better with a 3-button mouse. If you haven't got a 3-button mouse, you can go up to Edit, Preferences. Under Input, there's Emulate 3-button mouse there. Also, if you haven't got a numpad, which is used quite often in Blender, there's Emulate Numpad up here. If you tick one of these, it should be saved automatically, because if we look down here, you've got Auto Save Preferences turned on by default. So you can just close this down once you've ticked things. So to navigate with the 3-button mouse, we use the middle mouse button, hold that down, and we can rotate around, and we've got a focal point of the cube at the moment. You can kind of move the focal point by holding down Shift and middle mouse, and you can strafe around. If you're using the Emulate 3-button mouse, you'll have to hold down Alt and left click to emulate the middle mouse button. If you've got a wheel, you can wheel in and out for zooming. If you haven't got a wheel, you can hold down Control and hold the middle mouse button to zoom in and out. There's lots of extra options under the View menu up here. There's things like Frame Selected, which you can see is numpad period key. If I press on that, that will frame just this selected object, which is the cube. I'll zoom out with the middle mouse button and show you that you can select different objects with left click. So there's a light up here. This is a good time to introduce you to the outliner, which has our different objects. There's the cube that we had selected earlier. There's the light. And I can also left click in here to select the different objects. The last thing we have in our scene is a camera up here. So we've got a camera, light and cube. I can box select objects by left clicking and dragging over several objects. And you can see they're all selected now. And if I press the home key or go up to the view menu and frame all, you can see that it will frame everything, and the focal point is now in the middle here. We've also got a few options to the side here. So there's zooming in and out, and if I click that, I can zoom in and out or move the view. You can see I'm doing the same thing as the middle mouse button. I can also go into the camera and look through the camera by clicking this icon here and coming out by clicking it once again. There's also a perspective and orthographic view. At the moment, we've got this perspective as we view off into the distance. If I change it to orthographic, you can see it all looks a bit strange, but it's very flat and the lines are all straight so they don't go off into the distance. There's no vanishing point. I'll change that back to perspective as it's much less confusing, but it's very useful for lining up objects. We've also got our Cartesian coordinates up the top here. If I press the middle mouse button, you can see those moving around. It's very useful to get used to the idea of the different axes as they're labeled here. The positive of the axes are highlighted with their letters, and these are the negatives just here. You can actually click on these letters. So if I click on the Z, which is the up and down axes, I'll now view my objects from the top. So I'm viewing them basically from up here. And that's middle mouse button again to move out of those views. These options are also on your numpad. So I can press 7 for top view, 1 for front view, and you'll see the minus Y is looking at us here. So the positive Y goes away from us. So again, 1 for front view shows us minus Y, and 3 will show us side views. So we're looking along the X-axis there. And you'll get used to those as you move along and practice. So you might want to just pause the video here and have a quick play with those controls and make sure you're happy with them. So let's start adding a couple of objects. First of all, I'm going to hide the light and the camera because they can get in the way and be a bit confusing. I can come up to the outliner here and it's got a little eye icon. I can press that and it will hide it in my viewport. The camera icon is hiding it in my render. I'll just quickly bring back the camera to explain that. When we want to render our scenes, so turn them into a picture or a video, we always render looking through the camera. So have a quick think, how do I look through the camera? Hopefully you remembered it's this icon over here. That's also 0 on the numpad. If I press that, I can look through my camera, and that's what will be rendered if I want to turn my scene into a picture or animation. And again, I can just middle mouse button to move out of camera view. So if I click on the camera icon here, that will remove it from the render. So when I render my scene, that object won't be seen. We'll talk more about this later, but for now, I'll just hide it in the viewport and I'll hide the light as well because we don't need that. So we're left with our single cube. So pause the video, catch up with me, making sure you've hidden your camera and your light. Okay, so let's add some other objects into our scene. To do this, we can go up to the Add menu up here. We've got lots of options. You can also find this menu if you use the shortcut keys, holding Shift and pressing A. Now, like I say, there's lots of things we can add. We're going to stick to the Mesh menu here, as that's the most commonly used. So we'll start at the top and I'll add in a plane. Now, it looks a bit strange and it almost looks like nothing's happened. But you can see it's added a plane in the middle of our cube here. And basically when you add an object, it always adds it where your 3D cursor is, which is this icon in the middle here. You can move that by pressing Shift right click. And now if I press Shift A to add, mesh, and then let's add a circle, you can see that it's added a circle at the 3D cursor position. It also looks like we've lost our plane, but it is in the scene, as you can see up here. It's just within our cube. So pause the video, catch up with me, adding in a plane and a circle. So how do we move these objects? Well, I can left click them, and although I wouldn't recommend this, you can turn on, under the viewport gizmos, the move icon here, and you can then click and drag the different axes here, or grab in the middle there and move it perpendicular to your camera. I'll undo those movements though by pressing Ctrl Z, and under the move gizmos, you can see that there's a rotate and scale. I'm going to turn those off though, because I find them very distracting. And it's much better to get used to the keyboard commands. You'll be a much quicker Blender practitioner. The keyboard command for move is G. So I can press G and start moving that around. You can see the plane behind it now. And you can see I'm just moving it perpendicular to the camera. If I press X now, that will constrain it to the X-axis. Remember, you've got your Cartesian coordinates at the top here, so you can see which axis you want to choose. I can also now press a number, such as 5, to move it 5 grid units along the X-axis. I could at any point as well press the minus key to have -5 Blender units along the X-axis. Once you're happy, then you can press enter. So you can type in all your commands like that. So pause the video and catch up with me, moving your cube 5 Blender units in the negative X. Okay, so how do we remove any movement that we've made and put it back to the center? Well, there's two ways. The quickest way is holding down Alt and pressing G. I'll do that with the circle here because it's slightly out of position, so Alt G will remove any movement. So holding down the Alt key is often the remove or do the opposite of something. So holding down Alt while pressing G will remove any of the grabbing that you've done. The other way is to bring up my side panel. You can press on this little arrow here, or you can press the N key, and that both hides it and shows it. Under the item panel, you can see the location of my objects, and I can actually type in 5 in the X here, and that will move it 5 grid units across this way. The grid units should correspond to a meter, hence why there's an M after the number. You'll see we've got rotation and scale there as well. The keyboard shortcuts for that are the R key and the S key, so they're nice and easy to remember. So as a quick challenge to you, I want you to add in all the other mesh objects, and I want you to spread them out along the X-axis with a 5 meter distance between each of them. But before you start that, I'll just show you that you can move the 3D cursor back to the center, which makes it a little bit easier. By holding down Shift and S, you'll get a pie menu, and you can say cursor to world origin, and it jumps back to the middle. Now when you add objects, they'll be right in the center there. So pause the video and add each of those objects. Okay, so I'll zoom out a little bit with the wheel of my mouse. I'll move across slightly. I'll press Shift A to add, mesh, and then UV sphere. I'll press G, X, and 10 this time to move it across like this. Shift A to add mesh icosphere. You can see the difference between the UV sphere and the icosphere there. GX minus 10, move that across there. Shift A to add, and then cylinder, GX 15. Shift A to add, cone, GX minus 15. I'll zoom out a bit more. Add in the torus, GX 20, and add in the grid. It looks the same as the plane, but I'll talk about that in a moment. GX minus 20, and Shift A to add monkey. And we've got this fun monkey's head, which you can see there. So GX 25. So you should have them all lined up like so. Okay, let's select our monkey, as that's quite fun, and I want you to frame selected. Pause the video and have a go at that. So that's the period key on your numpad, and it zooms us in and moves the camera, and that becomes our focal point. Okay, now I want you to go to side view. Have a go at that. So side view is the x-axis here, and it's numpad 3. So numpad 3, and I can look along the x-axis. Notice it puts us in orthographic view, and I can change this to go back to perspective, and press it again to go back to orthographic. As soon as I come out of that side view, you can see we come back to perspective, as we can now see a vanishing point. So go back to side view. Now I want to rotate my object, so I can press R to rotate, and you can see it's rotating perpendicular to the camera, so it's rotating along the x-axis like this. I can then press G to grab, so I can move it above the y-axis as if that's an imaginary floor, like this. So pause the video and have a go at doing that. Okay, so I'll come around to the front. Let's take our plane here, and I'm going to scale it up 10 times. So I'm going to press S to scale, and you can see it's scaling there, and then type in 10, and it scales it up nice and big. Okay, so as a bit of practice, I want you to place these objects so they're randomly placed, but sitting on top of the floor. So you'll have to move some of them up, and I want you to take the cylinder and the torus and rotate them and have them resting on the floor. The torus will be upright, and the cylinder will be kind of lying on its side. Hopefully that makes sense. Before we do that, I'm going to delete my circle here. If that's a little bit difficult to select, you can always select it in the outliner and press delete. And I'm going to get rid of the grid as well. I'll do that because it's almost identical to a plane. It just has more subdivisions, which I'll talk about later. So I'll press delete on that. And for the rest of the objects, you need to place them on your floor as your challenge. Okay, I'll press N to get rid of my side panel, as that's a bit distracting. And I'll start off by selecting the monkey and moving that into position. Now you might think if I press G to grab and move it into position like this, it'll be on top of the floor. But if I come around to the side, it's not. So we need to be a bit more careful than that. So I'll undo that movement, and it moves back to this position. I can press G to grab in the x-axis, and it will constrain it to the axis, therefore be sitting on the floor because we already rotated it over here. So it's a good idea to go to side view to move the objects above the floor. The floor is in line with the y-axis here, so I can press G to grab and move that upwards in the z-axis and make that sit above the floor. However, this one we need to rotate 90 degrees. So I'm going to press R, then 90 to rotate it 90 degrees, and then press G to grab in the Z-axis and move it above the floor. So about there looks about right. The cylinder, we need to rotate that 90 degrees, so R 90. And again, it's rotating perpendicular to the camera, so it's rotating along the X-axis because I'm in side view. I'll press G to grab, move that above the floor, and I should be able to box select these next objects, and that's got all the objects just there. Go to the side view and press G to grab in the Z-axis and move those above the floor like this. Okay, so they're all sitting on the floor. Now I can go to top view and start just placing them on the floor in a random position. So I'm just selecting them, pressing G to grab and moving them into position. And now I have a nice little scene just here. Now, if you're particularly proud of what you've done and you want to save your work, you can go to File and then Save, as with most programs. And you'll see your files here. It's a little bit different to what you might be used to with Windows, but you can easily scroll down and find recent files or your hard drives here. I'll just save this as tutorial 1. Okay, so we can navigate the viewport, we can add objects, and we can move and rotate and scale them. What about coloring in, or texturing as we'd call it? Well, at the top of our screen, you can see that we've got different workspaces as they're known. Where we do the coloring in, as it were, is under the shading workspace. And you can see the workspace change. We've still got our outliner over the right-hand side here. and the properties panel, which we'll talk about a bit later. We've also got a file browser, so we can browse textures and drag them in and put them on our objects. And it's worth noting that in the top left-hand corner, you have all the types of window available to you. And you can see this one is the 3D viewport, and this one is the file browser. This one down here is the image editor. So we can see the images that we're using in the one next to it, which is the shader editor. And this might look different to you depending on what you have selected in the scene. I've got my torus selected, and that's got no material at the moment. Now things can get extremely complicated in the shader editor, but we're going to keep it fairly simple. Now one really important aspect that you need to understand about materials is that we create a material and it's like a paint bucket. And that paint bucket will paint different objects. But if we were to change the paint bucket or the material, then each of the objects that share that material would have that material change. I'll show you what that looks like. So for example, if I start with the default cube, now that has a material already, and it's just a white material that we can see there. And its name is material in the naming panel here. Now in this drop down next to it, I can show you all the materials in the scene, and there's only one. If I click one of the other objects, they have no material. They look exactly the same because the default material is the same as the material shown when you have no material. So let's start off selecting the default cube and rename the material by clicking in this box, and I'll call it red. And if you can't see the nodes, then you might need to zoom out a bit, or remember you can press the home key to frame all selected, or the period key will do the same thing. And remember you can find that under the view menu, frame selected and frame all. If for any reason these aren't selected, so if I press Alt A, that will deselect all, we can't now press the home key or the period key. A is the keyboard shortcut to select all, and then I can select those options. So if, for example, we were off screen here, I can press A to select all, and then the period key, and it would frame the selected objects. To navigate this, once again, it's the middle mouse button to move around and zoom in and out, or again, hold down Control and press the middle mouse button. Let's zoom in and look at this material then. So this is a node-based material system. It goes from left to right. So if I change something here, that will then be changed by this one here, which then goes to the material output, which shows us the color. At the moment, we've only got one node, but it's got lots of options we can change. So the base color being the obvious one, I'll click on that, and that goes to our color wheel. It's worth pointing out that if I zoom in and click on that, the color wheel becomes bigger. It's a bit distracting because it's overlapping our objects, so I'll just move out a little bit and click on it, and you can see it's a bit smaller. I can then drag this point across to the red. So in this color wheel, the more saturated you want the color, the more you go to the outside of the circle. And you can see the color of the cube change to less saturated the closer into the middle I am. So go nice and red, and then you've got a value slider down the side here, which will take it from dark to light. Generally, you don't go all the way to light. You save that for compositing. That's why the default is somewhere around here. Okay, so we've got a nice red material here. I'll click on one of my other objects, so the monkey, for example, and now I can add a new material here, or I can use this red material that I've already made over here. So I'll click on that. And lots of beginners make the mistake of thinking, well, I want to change the color of the monkey, so I'll change this here to purple, but both of the objects are changing. That's because, remember, this is a paint bucket, and they are both being affected by this paint. I'll undo that change with Control Z. Let's say I wanted a different material for the monkey. Well, I would have to select the monkey and add new material over here. There's two options to this. If I add a new material pressing the new material button here, whilst I've got a material open here, it creates a new material based on this red material here. However, if I close this material down, it goes white back to default and create a new one. It starts with a completely new one like this. So I'll call this blue, and I'll change that across to the blue. Okay, so pause the video here, catch up with me, and go across to the shading workspace, select the default cube, and change its base material to a red, and rename it red. And then select the monkey, give it a new material, calling it blue, and change that to blue. As a challenge, I want you to change the torus, giving that a new material, and give it maybe a purple. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you got okay with that. Let's select the torus, give it a new material, and we'll go across to the purple. Okay, let's very briefly look at some of the other options that are available to us here. There's a metallic option, and at the moment it's dielectric, which is the word for non-metallic objects. And generally this slider is either all metallic or not metallic. So we'll change that to all metallic, and you can see how that changes. We can also turn the roughness right down, and it makes it really shiny like this. So all these sliders go from 0 to 1, which is full, and in this case fully rough, and you can see it being quite rough there, or no roughness, which is fully shiny. So as a quick challenge to you, I want you to give all the other objects a different kind of material and maybe experiment with the roughness and metallic. Okay, so hopefully you got okay with that. So we select a new object, we click on new and we change the color. This time I'll change it to a mid-green like this, a sort of pale green, and we'll make it a bit darker. I'll put the roughness all the way down so it's a shiny, plasticky sort of looking material, and that looks interesting. It sort of twinkles when you move around, it's nice. And hopefully you've added colors to the other objects as well. Now you might notice that you don't really use these side panels much, especially as a beginner. You probably just want more space for your shader editor and your 3D viewport. We can easily get rid of these panels. There's a couple of ways. The easiest is to come to the corner where your cursor changes to this crosshair like this, and then you can left click and drag over the other one like that. And you've got this little arrow which says which one do you want to keep. And we want to keep the 3D viewport, so we'll overlap that one. And we can do the same for this one down here. So I can click and drag and move it over the other one. But I'm going to right click to cancel that. And I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to click and drag and pull out a new window. So just be aware that you can pull out new windows like this. So we can overlap this one to that one and overlap this one to that one like that. If for any reason you made a mistake choosing the wrong way, then you can choose the shader editor from in here. So pause the video and change the layout of your workspace slightly. Okay, so now's a good time, if I zoom out a bit so I can see most of my objects, to think about the display settings and the render settings. Now, when you come across to the shading workspace here, it puts us into this viewport shading mode called material preview mode. If we go back to the layout workspace, you can see it's all gray, and that's got what's called solid display mode. There are two next to that. One is wireframe. This can be very useful for lining up objects and selecting objects that are in the background to other objects. And next to that there is X-ray. If I go back to solid mode and turn on X-ray, it sort of goes see-through, which again is very helpful to select objects in the background, as you can see here. So I can kind of select through the cube. I'll turn X-ray off though, and let's go back to the shading workspace, which defaults to material preview mode. So material preview mode means we can preview the materials. The more you put into your scene and the more materials you put on those objects, the more complicated your scene becomes, and therefore the more processing power your computer will take to render the image that you see on the screen. That's one reason why we have material preview mode and rendered mode. If I scroll down a bit and find my light, which is just here, you can always bring this panel down if you need to see more of the outliner. My light's just here and I can make that visible in the scene, but you can see that it's not having any effect on our objects. Material preview mode does not take into account the lights in your scene unless you set it to. And the reason again is for viewport performance, as well as being able to see your materials in their basic form, because lights, especially if they're colored lights, could change the look of your materials. Now in the shading workspace in material preview mode, you have this little ball down here, and that is called an HDRI, a high dynamic range image, that's in the background of our scene, and you can kind of see it very blurred there. What that's doing is giving a very natural looking light to this scene. So the bright parts, which you can see up here, are giving off a bit of light. These greeny parts are actually giving off a little bit of colored light, and the darker parts are giving off much less light, until you go all the way to something that's very dark, perhaps over here, that's giving off hardly any light at all. So these HDRIs give a really nice looking natural light to your scene. So in material preview mode, that's how our scene is lit, but we can't at the moment see any shadows. So it's actually a little bit difficult to separate the objects from the floor and see that they're sitting on the floor from different angles. Now with my light turned on, if I go to rendered view, which is the one next to it, we can see the results that we will end up seeing when we render through the camera. So if I press 0 on my numpad, that's the camera view, and that's what our render will look like. And now we can start to see these shadows. I'll press 0 again to come out of that. And if I click on the light and press G to grab, you can see those shadows moving around. At the moment, this isn't too tough for the computer to handle, especially given the render engine that we're using, which I'll talk about in a second, but just pause the video here, catch up with me, looking at those different viewport settings and bringing the light back in and going to rendered view. Now you'll notice in rendered view that we haven't got that nice background, we've only got this light lighting the scene. If you want to change the background at all, you have to go into the shader editor, and under this drop down here where it says object, we can change that to world. Again, I can press the period key to frame selected or the home key to frame all. And you should be a little bit more familiar with this setup now. We've got this background going into the world output instead of the material output, which we had before. We've got a strength option here, which is the strength of the background. I can change that to black or back up to 1. You can actually go above 1 as well, and it becomes brighter and brighter. And we can also change the color here. And notice that it changes the color of the shadows and the objects as well. It gives them a bluer color. I'll undo those changes though, and we'll go back to grey. To give a nice natural look, we really want to add an HDRI to the beginning here. I'll select all with A and press G to grab to move those across the side slightly. And I want to bring in a new node in here. So there's the add menu here, and under the texture, we want to add in a new environment texture. It's not an image texture, although it is a type of image. It is an environment texture, which is slightly different. So I'll click on that and bring it to the front here. When I hook this up from the color to the color by clicking and dragging, the background turns purple. That's because there's no image in here yet, and we need to open one up. Now, to find great HDRI images, Polyhaven is certainly the best place in my opinion. Link in the description. If I scroll down, you can see they've got textures available as well and some models. But over on the left here, we've got Browse HDRIs. All of these are HDRIs which have a different sort of feeling to them. This is a very grey look. This will give a very bright, sharp shadow from the sun here. And you can see the results of the HDRIs in the bottom here on these different textured spheres. And you can probably see that this one is slightly more green because of this meadow background compared to this one, which is much more grey. And this one has a really bright spot because of the sun. So let's download one of these HDRIs. I'll download this dam bridge here. It can be any of them, it doesn't matter too much. Up in the top right hand corner, you've got a download option here. I would suggest sticking with the 2K. You don't need to go higher than that unless you're doing hyper realistic scenes. And even then it's questionable. So I'll download this file. Now back into Blender, if I press open, I can find that file. I have a folder full of HDRIs that I put in my bookmarks, and you can easily add folders to your bookmarks here and get rid of them here. So I'll click on my HDRI folder, find that dam bridge just here. Incidentally, you can click up the top here in the display mode and you can see detailed list or just an ordinary list or the pictures themselves, which is much easier. So with that selected, I'll press open image, and now you can see that nice HDRI lighting our scene in the background there. So pause the video, make sure you've caught up with me adding an HDRI image to your background. Okay, so I'm going to click on the cube now and I want to change the material, but you'll notice I can't see my shader editor. But you'll notice I can't see the material in the shader editor. So we need to remember to change this back from world to object, and then I can see my material just there. I'm going to change this so it's really shiny, so roughness all the way down, and we can see a bit of shininess there, and I'll turn the metallic all the way up. So it should be super shiny. But unfortunately, I can kind of see the background reflected in it, but I can't see the floor being reflected. Let's see what it looks like in material preview mode. And it's much the same. I can see the background being reflected, but not the floor. So back to the rendered view. The reason for this is the way the render is set up. Once again, by default, it's a little bit basic so that it's as easy as possible for your computer to render the image that's on the screen. To change the render settings, we come across to our properties window here. So that's the property window on the side here. The render settings is the second one down. So if I click on that, and at the top you can see we've got 3 render engines. Basically, don't worry about Workbench, it's very rarely used, unless you're working perhaps on an animation. Eevee and Cycles are the 2 commonly used. Eevee is really fast and is what Material Preview Mode uses, but it's not completely realistic. It tries to fake realism. Cycles is much closer to realism. Let's click on Cycles now. If I click on Cycles, you can see the results there, but when I move around my viewport, it takes a few seconds to update and it's all grainy. What we are seeing though is some nice shadows from this light just here, as well as the HDRI, which are quite soft coming from the HDRI. What I mean by soft is the edges are kind of soft and blurry. We can also see some reflections in this cube here. We can see the monkey and we can even see the floor. Looks like it's see-through there, but if I move to a different position, you can see it's just a reflection. And you can see the torus in the background. Incidentally, you can select an object with left click and right click on it and shade smooth if you want smooth shading, and that looks a lot better. But anyway, back to Cycles. What you can do to speed things up is if you've got a compatible GPU, you can change the device to a GPU. Now, if you can't see it in here, then you may have to go up to Edit, Preferences, and under System, under CUDA, you should be able to see your GPU there. I've got an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4090, which is a really high quality GPU. I would thoroughly recommend NVIDIA, not just because they're sponsoring this video, but because they support optics. And if I go across to optics and tick my GPU there and close this down, I can then under the sampling section here, so I can click on this drop down and go to sampling. Sampling is all this graininess that you see around here. Well, I can turn on the denoise. Now already that's moving fairly quickly and it's not bad. That's just the GPU working normally. It's quite a powerful GPU. But under this denoise drop down, I've got an option here, turn the denoiser on to optics. Now this is super quick. It's almost as if I'm viewing it like it's real time, and it gets rid of that noise really fast. Now initially you will see a difference between open image denoise, which is the default, and optics, but you'll really notice the difference when you start adding more complicated scenes. Optics can make a really big difference. This brings us nicely onto today's sponsor, NVIDIA. NVIDIA Studio is all about using the NVIDIA RTX GPUs to accelerate creative applications like Blender, using the power of the GPU and AI. NVIDIA are really leading the way when it comes to improving performance in Blender. And the great thing is Blender takes advantage of the dedicated GPU hardware. The ray tracing and AI cores make it even faster. When you have an RTX GPU and enable NVIDIA optics, Blender will use the ray tracing cores in cycles to accelerate how quickly lighting is rendered in the scene, and use the AI cores to denoise the image even faster. This gives almost real-time feedback, even in complicated scenes. This makes your workflow so much quicker. And you can see here I'm using AI to denoise the image, and it massively improves the viewport performance. And also when it comes to rendering, it really greatly reduces your rendering times, which has been absolutely tremendous for me. As a Blender user, I wouldn't choose any other GPU except NVIDIA RTX. Okay, so thank you for listening. Back to the render settings if I scroll down. That's the viewport settings. Underneath that we have the render settings. So when we do render out our scene, which is up the top here, render, F12 is short, we see through our camera, and you can see the samples going up there. That's how detailed our image is. And then the denoise does its work afterwards. Of course, we need to move the camera and all sorts, but we'll do that in a moment. I'll just close this down. So in the render settings, we can also turn on things like optics if you have that available. The nice thing is you can set a time limit to your render. So if I put this to 1 second and press F12, so it renders the image in just over 1 second, and then it adds the denoising afterwards, which has done a fantastic job. You wouldn't really realize that this was a noisy image at all. If I turn the denoise off, we can see what that looks like in 1 second. It's not too bad, but you can kind of see the graininess there. When you have a lot more complicated scenes, the denoising option is a godsend. So I'll close that down, turn back the denoiser, and let's scroll up again. So that cycles the render engine. I'll turn back to Eevee for now, and you can really see the difference in quality. However, we can improve this slightly. One thing you'll want to turn on is the ambient occlusion. If I turn that on and off, you can just about see a little bit of difference around these sort of areas. If I click on the drop down and change the distance and turn that up a bit, you'll start to see these sort of shadows emerge. So what it's doing is in the crevices, it's adding a bit of shadow, which makes it look a bit more realistic. The other thing that's worth turning on is screen space reflections. And that tries to kind of fake the reflections that might come off these objects. Again, it's not as good as cycles, but it does help quite a bit. And you can see the floor and the torus in the background there. It's all very blurry. You can actually, in the drop down, turn off half trace, and that makes it more detailed. If I tap that a couple of times, you can see the detail being added, but it still isn't quite as good as cycles. But for now, that will work for us. And if you've got a bit of a slower machine, you'll certainly want to use Eevee. Okay, so pause the video here and just experiment a bit with those render settings and make sure you add those Eevee settings. Okay, so we've got a basic scene here. How do we move the camera into a nice position? Well, first of all, let's look through our camera. Try and remember the keyboard shortcut for that. So that's 0 on your numpad. I can press N to bring up the side panel. I can then go to the View tab just on the side here, and under View, View Lock, Lock, Camera to View. I can bring this out so you can read it all, and tick that. Now with that ticked, I can move around my camera as if it's a viewport. So using the same keys as if I were moving around the viewport. So we can get it into a nice position like this, and again press F12 to render, and that's rendering using Eevee. It took less than a second. And of course I could change across to cycles, so I'll scroll up to the top, go to cycles and render that one out. Took a tiny bit longer, but we do get a much nicer image. Okay, so we've got the basics of moving around the scene, adding objects, adding colors and render settings. So let's try making a scene together. I'll close this window down, I'll go back into layout view, and I'm going to select all my objects and add them to a collection. So everything in the scene, I'll select it all. Incidentally, I've not got my camera visible, so that's not including the camera. And to move them to a new collection, you press M to move to new collection. Create a new collection, I'll call this Objects on Floor. Press enter and press OK. Now I can easily hide all those objects in both the viewport and the render. So I'm basically back to my startup file. So pause the video here, catch up with me, putting all your items into a new collection. Then hide that collection. I'm going to click on my original collection to make sure anything I add now will be added to that collection. And I'm going to add in an icosphere. So Shift A to add, Mesh, and then icosphere. Now before you do anything, moving it around or scaling it, just notice down the bottom left here, we've got some parameters for our icosphere. So if I zoom in, I can change these subdivisions, for example, and it changes the detail level of my icosphere. Now one thing to note, if I press S to scale, for example, this changes and we can't actually get back to it because we've changed our shape, so we've set in the parameters for that icosphere. So I'm going to press delete and add it again. So Shift A to add, Mesh, and then icosphere. This is going to be our planet, by the way. Make sure you've got 3 subdivisions there, and we'll set the radius to 3 meters. So it's a nice big icosphere there. Make sure you add an icosphere, not a UV sphere, because it's really fun to change the shape around of this. Okay, so pause the video there and catch up with me adding in an icosphere with 3 subdivisions. Okay, let's move this into the middle of our scene. Now you should be able to see that this icosphere has lots of separate faces. And what I want to be able to do is to go into this object and make changes to those faces. To go into this object, we come up to the top here to the interaction mode, and we change it from object to edit mode. And you can see how the shape changes there. Oh, I'm noticing my camera is not centered on my object, so I'll press the period key to frame it so I can move around it easily. Now straight away you can start to see the points that we have on it. Those are called vertices. And you can see next to the interaction mode, we've got 3 separate modes. This one's selected, and that's vertex mode. The next one to that, if I click on that, is edge mode. And you can see all the edges being highlighted. Then there's face mode, and I can now highlight the different faces by left clicking. Remember, you can also box select like this, and you can actually hold down Control and box select to deselect objects that are selected. The shortcut keys for getting to each of these is 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard. Now, if you are emulating the numpad, they won't be available to you, and you'll have to click on the icons. But with vertex selected, I can select a vertex and I can press G to grab and move it around. I'll undo that movement. The same with edges. I could select a few edges and then G to grab to move them around, but I can also S to scale and R to rotate. And remember, that happens perpendicular to the camera. So if I come around to the side here and press R to rotate, I can make it stick out a bit more. Now with 3 edges selected like this, if I go to face mode, you can see it selects that face for me, or I can select a group of faces like so. So pause the video, catch up with me going into edit mode and just having a bit of an experiment with those selection options. Do make sure that you revert back to this UV sphere here and save your work before you do any of those changes in case you're worried about messing things up. Okay, now with our icosphere, you can see that it's got a kind of rounded, neat looking pentagon of faces just here. If I select those, do make sure you're on face mode though, that's face mode with 3. And we're going to make some craters on this planet. Incidentally, these are all my reference images. And I'd just like to point out, I've got this idea from this great artist here. There's lots of people that have done this rocket launching idea, which looks fantastic, but I really like this planet. This is from an artist, Alex Pushelin, I believe. Incidentally, this is called a PureRef board. It's really useful because you can move it around on top of the program, zoom in and out, and you can click and drag images into it as well. It is available for free, link in the description. Okay, so with this pentagram selected here, we want to be able to pull out a shape. The way we do that is under the face menu, there's an option to extrude faces, and you can see the shortcut key for that is E. So I'm going to use the shortcut. I'll come around to the side here so you can see what's happening a bit more easily. So I'll zoom in on this area, and I'll press E to extrude. And you can see this line appear. When I move my mouse up and down now, it pulls these faces outwards. So we can pull those faces out like that. And we've got this funny sort of crater type thing here. Now you can scale this down, so I could scale it down very slightly. So I pressed S to scale, and if you hold down Shift, you can scale in smaller increments. So I can just scale it a bit like this, so it's sticking in just a touch. I'll try that a little bit further. S to scale, come into about there. Okay, so E to extrude, pulling it out, and then S to scale it down slightly, and you can hold down Shift for smaller increments. And incidentally, with this dialog box open here, you can see how much I've scaled things if you want to roughly get the same amount as me. So pause the video and catch up with me, extruding out that small pentagon section there. Now if I come around to the front, you'll notice as well in the face options, there's also an inset option, and the shortcut for that is I. So these are the most commonly used, E and I. Let's show you what that looks like. If I press I now, it insets the faces, bringing them in like this, and then left click to set. Now I'm just going to undo that a moment and show you a problem that lots of beginners come up against. I'll zoom in a fair bit. I'll press I to inset and then left click so it's set. So I've accidentally insetted the faces, but it looks like nothing has changed. But if I go up to wireframe now, it's a little bit tricky to see, but if I come around to the side here, you can see each of the faces has a dot in the middle of it, and there's actually a face sitting in the middle of these two lines here, and another one here. So we actually have created a set of faces in there when we inset. So I'll go back to solid mode. If you accidentally do that, you can select everything with A. Then under the mesh menu, there is an option to merge vertices. The shortcut key is M, and that's used quite often, so try and remember that if you can. By distance is what we want to use. If I click that, I've got a message down the bottom here, removed 5 vertices. So it has merged those vertices together. I've also got a dialog box down here where I can up the merge distance. If I keep bringing this up higher and higher, you can see it starts to merge anything that's within 96 centimeters. I'll undo that change, of course, and we're back to having our vertices merged. I can always check that by going into wireframe and just checking. Oh, and you can still see the faces in there. I didn't actually merge them. So back to solid mode, select all with A and then M to merge by distance. I need to change this to 0.001, I think it is, and it's got 5 vertices removed. Okay, so let's zoom in, select those faces. This time I'll press I and move my mouse across to somewhere like here, which is great. And then I'm going to press E again to extrude and pull it inwards this time. So it goes roughly in the same distance. Again, with this dialog box down here, you can see a distance that I've gone in the local Z axis. I'll talk about that a bit later. I might scale it down a little bit again, so S to scale, so we can kind of see the inside edges a bit. Okay, so we created a simple crater like that. Pause the video and catch up with me. Okay, so a bit of practice. I want you to do that across your shape. So we'll do another one together. I'll select these ones, which are fairly consistent. You have to be a bit careful because ones like this are a little bit crooked, but that could be the look you want to go for. But I'll go for slightly more even shaped ones. So E to extrude to pull out, probably about to there. Let's have a look. It's a little bit too far. So I can change the Z parameters just here and pull it back in. Probably about there, I think. So we'll look at the other one. This is a bit bigger, so it's going to stick out a bit further maybe. Maybe a little bit in. Now I'm going to press I to inset and bring that in, and then E to extrude to pull it backwards to somewhere around there. And we're creating these fun craters. I'll do one more up here. This is a fairly even one. This time I'm going to do it slightly different and go inwards. So I'm going to press E to extrude and move my mouse down to pull it inwards and then scale it down very slightly. So we're creating some fun craters like this. I'll leave a fairly clear patch at the top. That's where our rocket's going to take off from. But what I want you to do now is to go around your shape, adding in some random craters like this. So hopefully you got okay with that. I'll just quickly do a few more. This one here is a little bit close to that one, so I might come down here. I know it's a little bit of a funny shape, but let's just pull that out, scale it in slightly, I to inset, pull that in, E to extrude, and pull it inwards. Let's grab this one here. I'll just pull that in, so E to extrude and scale that down. This one here maybe, E to extrude, pull it outwards. It's a bit too far, so let's bring that down a bit. You can click and hold on these numbers and pull them side to side to change the number a bit more quickly. S to scale, I to inset, bring that in, E to extrude, S to scale a little bit there. Let's choose one from this side. Let's go for a sort of crookedy one and see what that looks like. So E to extrude and pull that inwards. And S to scale a bit. That looks quite fun still. This one here maybe, E to extrude, S to scale, I to inset, and E to extrude. This one here, E to extrude, and I'll scale that down. Maybe one up here, E to extrude, S to scale, I to inset, E to extrude. And one at the bottom here, E to extrude, S to scale, I to inset, E to extrude. Now, if for any reason you think, oh, one's sticking out way too far, so let's take this one here. Let's pretend it was sticking out far too far and we wanted to bring it back in. Now I can go in and select each of these faces, and then we need to come around to the side here and then G to grab and move those in. Now to select edge loops like this a bit more quickly, you can Alt left click on a line going across a loop that you want to select. So if I Alt left click here, it selects that entire edge loop across there. So for example, if I want to select these ones coming around here, I can Alt left click on those, and then I can come around to the side here, G to grab and move it in or out. I could even scale it down a bit if I wanted to. I'll undo that because I think it was fine where it was. Okay, so we've got a fun planet. Hopefully you've come up with something similar yourself. In the next video, we'll be completing our fun planetary scene, and I'll be releasing that in just a couple of days. So make sure you've saved your work. Thank you once again to NVIDIA for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.